This is a quick look at the lives of poorer or ordinary women in ancient Rome. The videos that I've done so far tended to look at patrician class women, women with more money, women from higher social status. Certainly, if we look at the position of women in the late Republic into the early Imperial Age, a lot of the benefits I've mentioned and a lot of the developments I've mentioned in other videos may have applied to ordinary women, but less so. Life for ordinary women in Rome was much more traditional, and they did not often benefit from the changes at the top of the social structure. As was the case throughout history until really the 20th century, if we're being honest with ourselves, most women had a life of domestic work. Some would have had the chance to learn other skills in order to take employment elsewhere, but by and large, they would have led lives either looking after their own house or looking after somebody else's house as a servant or a slave. Inscriptions left, funeral inscriptions are one of our best sources. They reveal that women took jobs as actresses, singers, painters, caretakers, nurses, even doctors and philosophers. So there is a huge range of occupations, but we have to remember for the large majority of ordinary Roman women, women who did not come from wealth, who did not have status, they would have had a very modest sort of a life. Many would work alongside slaves, and if you needed a symbolic demonstration of what the status of women was like in ancient Rome, that's a pretty good one, isn't it? That they were, in many places, the equals of slaves. They would work in small workshops, small local industries and factories and so on. They would live with their husbands and their children in the insulae. For those of you who don't know, the insulae, singular insula, literally means an island, but in ancient Rome it was the name given to a tenement block. So you would have a block of flats perhaps 4 or 5 stories high, certainly not much more than that. And it was very cheap accommodation. Families would usually occupy only 1, possibly 2 rooms. There was no plumbing, especially the further up you went. Perhaps on the ground floor there may have been some plumbing for the shops that tended to occupy the ground floor of the insulae, but further up, no plumbing, so no washing facilities, and importantly, no cooking facilities, which meant that Romans would have to go out to buy bread. They would have to go out to eat. As a result, we believe that thermopolia, these kind of snack shops that sprung up all over the Roman world, they were quite modestly priced so that everybody had a place where they could eat. But this is to some degree speculation. There are instances in the documents that show that some Romans did attempt to bring cooking facilities into the insulae, like a brazier, a metal basket inside which you would have burning wood or coal. But especially bearing in mind that the insulae were cheaply put together so that landlords could make more money from them, it wouldn't take much for a brazier to fall over and burn an entire block to the ground, and indeed many fires throughout Rome were as a result of poor people attempting to cook in their own houses. You've got me drifted from the point again. It was hard in the tenement blocks because there were no washing facilities except perhaps in the courtyard down below. That meant that disease and illness would spread much more quickly. You can't talk about the lives of ordinary women in any ancient culture without making mention of prostitution. It's called the oldest profession because a woman, even if she has no education, if she has no talent, she has no skills, she has no other way of making money, this is the one way in which all women could make money. it's desperate and it's grim and it's unpleasant and all the rest of it, but we have to acknowledge it. Loads of women in the ancient world became slaves, and Rome was no different. In Rome, if you wanted to be a prostitute, you had to register with the aediles or the aediles, and prostitutes had a particular way of dressing, which is worth looking up. It's quite interesting, and their own religious cult. Most of the religious rites of prostitutes took place in April. Again, very interesting, but also kind of demonstrates that the Roman state was accepting of prostitution to the extent that it allowed religious worship of the religious of the cult to which most prostitutes would have belonged. And finally, and this is again maybe dragging us back down to something a little less pleasant, it's believed that a lot of waitresses who worked in the thermopolia or maybe in the bars would also double up as prostitutes as a way of making money. It's grim, but there we are. And we'll finish here with a view of a Christian writer. He says, Lactantius, he says, in addition to the freedom of speech that pours forth every obscenity, the prostitutes, at the importunities of the rabble, strip off their clothing as they act as mimes in full view of the crowd. And this they continue until full satiety comes to the shameless lookers-on, holding their attention with their wriggling buttocks. The satirist Juvenal also makes mention of nude dancers, and perhaps maybe makes reference to prostitutes being employed to fight in gladiatorial contests. Certainly gladiatrices, singular gladiatrix, there is evidence of that. Whether they were prostitutes, you would need to do your own research into that. And God help you, and God help your internet search history. Any questions? Ask me in class.